Part 1. After the old stars. An inherited value can continue to guide a life long after its foundation has ceased to persuade. A person may no longer believe that morality descends from heaven, yet still speak of sacred duties. A society may distrust religious authority, yet retain ideas of guilt, equality, truth, and sacrifice that were shaped within religion. The old language remains in use while its source of authority grows faint. Friedrich Nietzsche saw 19th century Europe living inside this delay. For him, the danger was not that disbelief would arrive. The danger was that people would fail to understand what their disbelief had already changed. Nietzsche named this crisis with the unsettling formula that God is dead. He did not mean that a divine being had recently suffered a literal death, nor was he merely celebrating atheism. In the gay science, the announcement comes as news even to people who do not believe. The point is cultural and evaluative. If the Christian God no longer provides a credible horizon for European life, then many convictions supported by that horizon must be reconsidered. Why tell the truth? Why regard each person as morally equal? Why treat suffering as meaningful or compassion as obligatory? Old answers may still be good answers. They can no longer be protected from inquiry simply by inheritance. This creates the central question of Nietzsche's work. How can human beings create and evaluate values after inherited foundations lose their authority without collapsing into nihilism or domination? Nihilism appears when the failure of one source of value is mistaken for the failure of all value. Domination appears when freedom from inherited rules becomes permission for the powerful to impose their preferences. Nietzsche confronts both dangers, but he does not always escape them. His language of rank, strength, breeding, conquest, and command creates real moral and political difficulties. Any responsible account must resist both easy condemnation and easy rescue. His answer develops through a sequence of experiments. The young scholar looks to Greek tragedy and art. The middle period writer becomes a historical psychologist and celebrates the free spirit. The later Nietzsche tests ideas of perspective, self-overcoming, value creation, eternal recurrence, and the will to power. In the Genealogy, he asks not only whether a moral belief is true, but what history produced it, what human needs it serves, and what kind of life it encourages. His late books sharpen the attack, sometimes beyond what sober argument can sustain. There is no single key that turns every lock in these writings. Nietzsche changes his mind. He speaks through masks, aphorisms, parables, polemics, and invented characters. A claim voiced by Zarathustra is not automatically a settled doctrine. A notebook entry is not equivalent to a book Nietzsche completed. Even his published statements can function as provocations designed to make a reader supply a missing objection. The task is therefore to follow the movement of his thinking while keeping interpretation separate from evidence. This movement matters because the crisis is not confined to 19th century belief. Whenever a moral language outlives agreement about its basis, people must decide what can be reconstructed and what must be released. The alternatives are rarely pure. Old values may contain accumulated wisdom and hidden injury at once. New values may liberate one capacity while exposing another person to loss. Nietzsche's work is valuable when it makes this mixed inheritance visible and dangerous when its impatience treats difficulty as weakness. What emerges is neither a moral recipe nor a license to choose anything at all. It is an account of valuation as an embodied human activity, shaped by history, affect, conflict, discipline, and imagination. Nietzsche asks us to inspect the maker's hidden inside supposedly timeless values. He also asks whether criticism can become creative without becoming cruel. To understand why that question became necessary for him, we begin with a young philologist caught between a parsonage, the ancient Greeks, a pessimistic philosopher, and a celebrated composer. Part 2. The Philologist and His Educators. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born in 1844 in Rocken, a small Prussian village near Leipzig. His father was a Lutheran pastor and died when Friedrich was still a child. The family moved to Naumburg, where Nietzsche grew up among his mother, sister, grandmother, and 2 aunts. This setting matters, though it should not be turned into a simple tale of rebellion against religion. Nietzsche knew Christian language from within. His later attacks gained force partly because he understood the moral atmosphere of piety, duty, sin, and redemption that he was opposing. At the boarding school of Pforta, he received an exacting education in Greek and Latin. He then studied classical philology at Bonn and Leipzig. Philology joins close reading to historical reconstruction. It asks how a text was transmitted, how a word changed, which layer is early, and which editorial decision altered what later readers received. Nietzsche would eventually direct these habits toward morality itself. He began with ancient manuscripts, but learned to treat concepts as documents whose histories might be reconstructed. The moral genealogist was prepared inside the classical scholar. His academic rise was remarkably swift. In 1869, at 24, he became professor of classical philology at Basel before completing the usual doctoral path. The appointment gave him a respected platform, yet his interests already exceeded ordinary disciplinary boundaries. He wanted scholarship to answer a broader question. What kind of culture helps human beings endure reality without falsifying it? He read the Greeks as evidence that brilliance could coexist with a lucid awareness of suffering. Their achievements seemed to challenge the thought that a healthy culture must hide life's instability. In 1870, during the Franco-Prussian War, Nietzsche briefly served as a medical orderly. He witnessed wounded soldiers and became seriously ill himself. The episode does not explain his later philosophy, but it complicates the image of an armchair worshipper of struggle. He knew that elevated language about conflict could meet bodies, infection, exhaustion, and chance. His later praise of hardness should be read beside this experience, though the experience did not prevent him from romanticizing severity. 2 modern figures became decisive educators. Arthur Schopenhauer described existence as driven by restless willing and therefore marked by frustration. Art could temporarily release us from willing, while ethical insight pointed toward compassion and renunciation. Richard Wagner appeared to offer a modern artistic community capable of renewing myth through music drama. Nietzsche became close to Wagner and Cosima Wagner, visited their household, and initially treated Wagner's art as an answer to cultural exhaustion. Philosophy, music, and friendship formed one powerful constellation. Nietzsche's early enthusiasm should not be confused with permanent agreement. His development is partly the story of becoming able to criticize his own educators. Wagner's nationalism, theatrical self-magnification, later Christian themes, and cultural circle increasingly repelled him. Schopenhauer's denial of the will came to seem like a magnificent expression of weariness rather than a final truth. Nietzsche would preserve their questions while reversing their evaluations. Where Schopenhauer asked how willing might be quieted, Nietzsche increasingly asked how striving could be transformed and affirmed. His health shaped the conditions of this transformation. Severe headaches, impaired vision, digestive illness, and recurring physical distress interrupted his teaching. By 1879, he resigned from Basel. For roughly a decade, he lived as an itinerant writer, moving among places in Switzerland, Italy, France, and Germany in search of climates and routines he could tolerate. Illness did not mechanically produce the philosophy, and it should not be romanticized. It did, however, make shifts of mood, energy, perception, and bodily capacity impossible for him to ignore. The solitary years also changed his intended audience. He no longer wrote mainly as a professor addressing a discipline. He wrote for hypothetical free spirits, future readers capable of allowing a book to disturb their habits. This audience could be intimate and strangely distant at once. Nietzsche sometimes sounds like a companion in private thought, then like a legislator speaking across centuries. That oscillation is part of his appeal and part of his danger. A reader can feel personally summoned before asking whether the summons deserves trust. The biography supplies conditions, not verdicts. A pastor's son need not become a critic of Christianity. A sick scholar need not praise health. A disappointed Wagnerian need not invent a philosophy of self-overcoming. What matters is the intellectual use Nietzsche made of these conditions. The first sustained use appears in a book that scandalized many fellow classicists. It proposed that Greek culture was illuminated by a tension between two artistic powers, and that suffering might be answered neither by optimism nor escape, but by form. Part 3. Apollo, Dionysus, and the Tragic Answer. The Birth of Tragedy appeared in 1872. It mixed classical speculation, Schopenhauerian metaphysics, Wagnerian cultural hope, and literary daring. Nietzsche later criticized its youthful excesses and its dependence on Wagner. Yet he continued to value its central problem. How could the Greeks, who perceived terror and instability so clearly, create a culture of such poise and beauty? His answer uses the names of two gods as symbols for distinct artistic tendencies, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Apollo represents lucid shape, measured boundaries, dreamlike images, and the principled separation of one individual from another. Sculpture offers a useful example. It gives a stable outline to a body and lets us contemplate a composed appearance. The Apollonian does not simply lie about suffering. It makes existence inhabitable by giving fleeting experience a visible contour. A painful event placed within a story can acquire distance. A confusing emotion represented in an image can be held before the mind without swallowing it. Dionysus represents intoxication, music, excess, becoming, and the loosening of ordinary individuality. In communal song or dance, the isolated self may feel absorbed into a wider life. Boundaries tremble. Creation and destruction appear intertwined. It is tempting to reduce the pair to order against chaos, but Nietzsche's account is richer. Apollo and Dionysus are artistic impulses, each capable of revelation and distortion. Pure Apollonian form can become sterile appearance. Unbounded Dionysian intensity can dissolve the form needed for art and agency. Attic tragedy, on Nietzsche's telling, joins them. The chorus supplies a Dionysian ground, while the dramatic figures provide Apollonian images through which that ground becomes visible. The spectator confronts loss, conflict, and fate without receiving a promise that everything works out for the best. Tragedy offers no final escape from becoming. It transforms the experience of becoming into something that can be affirmed aesthetically. This is the young Nietzsche's first major answer to pessimism. A culture may justify life through art, even when reason cannot demonstrate that life serves a moral plan. The historical story he attaches to this idea is much less secure. Nietzsche presents Socrates and the rise of theoretical reason as forces in tragedy's decline. The Socratic person trusts that knowledge can correct existence, that what is intelligible can be mastered, and that virtue depends on knowledge. Euripidean drama becomes, in this account, too explanatory and self-conscious. Many classicists rejected Nietzsche as evidence and method. and modern scholarship does not treat the book as a reliable history of tragedy's origin and death. Its lasting value lies more in its philosophical model than its historical reconstruction. When Nietzsche added an attempt at self-criticism to the later edition, he acknowledged that the book was badly written, overly confident, and burdened by the concerns of youth. He nevertheless defended its discovery of a pessimism born from strength. This retrospective gesture is characteristic. He does not simply withdraw an earlier work. He reinterprets it as evidence in the development of a thinker, preserving the question while altering the terms of its answer. That model already contains a tension that will follow Nietzsche. If art makes life bearable through appearance, the status of truth becomes uncertain. Whether artistic transfiguration is an honest response to existence or a beautiful evasion remains open. Nietzsche never settles this by choosing plain fact over all interpretation. Instead, he gradually asks which appearances deepen our engagement with life and which protect us from it. A tragedy may be invented, yet disclose patterns of fear, pride, and vulnerability. A dogma may be asserted as literal truth, yet serve an unacknowledged need to flee uncertainty. The book's political hopes are also troubling. Nietzsche imagines Wagnerian art contributing to a renewed German culture. His later break with Wagner taught him to distrust the fantasy of cultural salvation through a commanding genius and an ecstatic audience. Bayreuth, which he had hoped would embody renewal, appeared to him theatrical, nationalistic, and socially complacent. The disappointment did more than end a friendship. It made Nietzsche suspicious of his own desire for discipleship and collective redemption. Still, the tragic question survived the Wagnerian answer. Can human beings say yes to existence without pretending that suffering is deserved or finally redeemed? The mature ideas of eternal recurrence and amor fati will return to this question in altered form. Before they appear, Nietzsche passes through a colder season. He exchanges metaphysical drama for historical suspicion, the profit of culture for the experimenter, and the hope of communal myth for the discipline of a free spirit. Part 4. The free spirit changes the method. Human, All Too Human, published in 1878, announces a striking change of temperature. The flowing argument of the birth of tragedy gives way to numbered sections. Wagner and Schopenhauer recede. Voltaire becomes an emblem of intellectual independence. Instead of grounding art in metaphysical forces, Nietzsche examines religion, morality, genius, love, and social custom through psychology and history. Sublime ideals are returned to ordinary motives. What looked heavenly is shown to have a human workshop. This return to the workshop is not the same as cynical debunking. A belief can have a humble origin and still acquire value. Conversely, an exalted origin story does not guarantee a healthy result. Nietzsche's method asks how a practice became possible, what needs sustained it, and what effects it now produces. Moral feelings may grow from habit, fear, utility, imitation, social discipline, or forgotten advantage. The point is to replace miraculous beginnings with gradual formations, then evaluate the formations without the shelter of sacred ancestry. The aphoristic form suits this inquiry. A short section can isolate a motive, reverse a familiar judgment, and leave the reader to test the result. It can also contradict a neighboring experiment without pretending that a final system has absorbed both. Nietzsche's aphorisms are not random fragments, but neither are they pieces of a single concealed proof. They create an active reader. One must compare angles, notice changes of voice, and decide whether an observation reveals a pattern or merely displays the author's prejudice. This experimental style reaches a warmer register in the gay science. Poems, songs, jokes, psychological observations, and philosophical tests appear beside one another. The title recalls a joyful art of knowing traditionally associated with troubadour culture and resists the picture of thought as solemn renunciation. Knowledge can dance, but its lightness has been earned through convalescence. Cheerfulness is not ignorance of pain. It is the ability to think after pain without granting pain final authority. The free spirit is the imagined reader and product of this method. Freedom here does not mean the absence of all discipline. A free spirit has learned to loosen attachments that once felt necessary. This may require distance from nation, religion, profession, family expectation, and even one's own favorite conclusions. Such distance is not a permanent home. It is a condition for testing values. The free spirit risks becoming only a spectator if independence never becomes commitment. Dawn, published in 1881 and also known as Daybreak, turns the method more directly against morality. Nietzsche studies the feelings beneath judgments of duty and conscience. He suspects that moral interpretations simplify action by inventing a transparent agent with a clear motive and free choice. Actual action arises from competing drives, habits, bodily states, memories, and circumstances that consciousness only partly understands. Praise and blame may depend on a fictional picture of agency. This does not make action insignificant. It changes the question. Instead of asking only whether an act fits a universal rule, Nietzsche asks what kind of person and culture a pattern of evaluation produces. A rule praising selflessness might restrain exploitation, but it may also teach creative people to mistrust every strong desire. A practice of guilt might support responsibility, but it may also magnify self-punishment. Effects must be distinguished. The same discipline can cultivate patience in one setting and submission in another. Here we encounter an enduring strength of Nietzsche's approach. Values are not weightless propositions. They train attention, posture, emotion, expectation, and memory. To believe that anger is always shameful changes how anger is felt before it becomes action. To believe that suffering guarantees moral worth can make pain into evidence of virtue. A morality, therefore, has a physiology and a psychology, even when its defenders present it as pure reason. The danger is reduction. Explaining generosity partly through vanity need not make generosity disappear. A philosopher's doctrine can express temperament and still contain truth. Nietzsche sometimes invites the quick contrary conclusion, but his best work resists it. An origin explains how a belief became attractive. It does not by itself settle the belief's validity. The free spirit must learn suspicion without allowing suspicion to become another automatic faith. This balance leads toward Nietzsche's most fertile account of the human animal as a plurality of drives and effects. Part 5. The body, the drives, and the divided self. Traditional moral philosophy often imagines a unified subject. The subject knows its motives, deliberates, chooses, and deserves praise or blame. Nietzsche repeatedly questions each part of that picture. Conscious thought is only a small region of psychic life. What we call the self may be an arrangement of impulses with different strengths and histories. The body is not a container occupied by an independent soul. It is the living organization within which thinking, feeling, remembering, and valuing occur. A drive, in this context, is not a tiny person issuing commands from inside. It is a recurring tendency toward a kind of activity. Curiosity directs attention toward unanswered questions. Aggression seeks resistance or release. The desire for recognition makes certain social signs vivid. Drives interpret situations by selecting what matters. Two people can enter the same room and inhabit different practical worlds because different concerns organize what each notices. Affects are felt responses such as fear, hope, envy, joy, shame, or love. They are not merely disturbances added to neutral perception. They disclose significance. Fear makes a sound into a possible threat. Envy makes another person's success into a measure of one's own position. Gratitude gathers scattered events into the perception of a gift. Because affects help interpret the world, knowledge is never produced by an entirely disinterested spectator. The knower brings a trained and embodied orientation. Nietzsche's divided self is not therefore a heap without organization. Drives can form ranks, alliances, habits, and durable styles. A person may coordinate impulses through practice, education, artistic work, or a demanding project. Self-command is possible, but it is not the miraculous action of a will outside nature. It is an achievement within nature. One set of tendencies becomes capable of directing, redirecting, or sublimating others. The commanding element must also listen, because it depends on the energies it arranges. Sublimation names a useful possibility, even when Nietzsche does not supply a single technical theory of it. An impulse need not be either indulged in its first form or destroyed. It can be redirected. Competitive energy may enter scholarship. Aggression may become argumentative precision. Erotic longing may animate art. This transformation is not automatically noble. A scholarly rivalry can become petty, and art can become manipulative. Yet the model avoids a simple choice between repression and release. Nietzsche often speaks of health, sickness, nutrition, digestion, and convalescence. These are philosophical metaphors informed by bodily experience, not medical diagnoses that modern listeners should apply to themselves. Their best use is functional and asks whether an interpretation helps a person metabolize experience or traps experience in repetition. Their worst use turns disagreement, disability, or dependence into proof of inferiority. The metaphor must remain open to careful ethical correction in practice. It also complicates freedom. If conscious choice is shaped by forces it does not create, freedom cannot mean being an uncaused cause. Nietzsche is often skeptical of that idea, especially when it supports blame and punishment. A more modest freedom appears in his portraits of self-formation, the capacity to organize necessity into a style. We do not select our starting materials. We may still participate in how those materials are interpreted, trained, combined, and expressed. An ordinary example helps. Someone may recognize that a recurring need to win every discussion hides fear of being ignored. Merely naming the pattern does not dissolve it. The person might place that energy inside work requiring persistence and learn to remain silent in conversations where victory would damage understanding. The original drive has not vanished. Its relation to other concerns has changed. Nietzschean self-overcoming often looks like this: not a pure mind defeating a dirty impulse, but a living system reorganizing its powers. There is a serious circularity here. If the self that organizes drives is itself made of drives, who conducts the reorganization? Nietzsche offers no simple manager. Sometimes he suggests that a dominant project imposes order. Sometimes he emphasizes fortunate bodily organization. Sometimes his praise of discipline seems to restore the sovereign agent he elsewhere dismantles. The tension remains. It will matter when value creation is presented as a task. Before asking who can create values, however, Nietzsche asks what it means for any creature like us to know something as true. Nietzsche's appeal to the body does not replace philosophy with simple biological fact. The body is itself interpreted through medicine, culture, habit, metaphor, and the limited sciences available to him. His point is directed against the picture of a transparent, rational subject standing above instinct. Thought has a posture, a tempo, an appetite, and a history. Concepts can express the conditions under which a thinker learned to survive. This makes philosophical criticism partly diagnostic. Instead of asking only whether a claim is logically valid, Nietzsche asks what type of life needs the claim to be true. A doctrine that condemns desire may arise from experienced defeat, fear of competition, a need for control, or a disciplined aspiration that cannot be reduced to any one motive. Diagnosis does not automatically refute the doctrine. An argument can have compromised origins and still be sound. Nietzsche's method adds a question about value and function to the question of truth. The self becomes a shifting order among drives. One tendency seeks recognition, another rest, another knowledge, another security. Consciousness often speaks for the temporary winner and invents unity after the contest. I decided can conceal a process in which memory, bodily state, social expectation, and competing impulses reached a provisional arrangement. Nietzsche uses this division to challenge moral pride, but he does not reduce persons to chaos. A style of character can organize multiplicity without pretending it has become one substance. Health, in this framework, cannot mean the absence of conflict. It concerns the ability to incorporate tension, recover from disturbance, and place drives into productive relation. Nietzsche sometimes romanticizes illness as a source of insight, drawing from his own severe physical suffering. Illness can indeed change perspective, but pain does not guarantee wisdom and should not be glorified. His more defensible point is that every standpoint has conditions, including the standpoint called healthy. The body also returns morality to consequence. A value system shapes sleep, sexuality, aggression, attention, and social relation. Ideals are not harmless because they are spiritual. They train bodies, distribute shame, and decide which forms of vitality receive permission. Genealogy later examines these effects historically, but the bodily question is already present. What does this value do to the beings who live under it? Modern readers should resist turning drives into a new set of little agents inside the person. Nietzsche's language is exploratory and often metaphorical. Contemporary psychology and neuroscience offer different models of motivation, cognition, and embodied processing. They may echo his suspicion of a unitary self without confirming his particular vocabulary. The divided self finally changes responsibility. If motives are plural and partly unconscious, responsibility cannot rest on perfect self-transparency. It becomes the work of cultivating conditions, practices, and interpretations through which better orders of action emerge. One is responsible not because one created every drive, but because a life gradually participates in how drives are educated, expressed, and ranked. Part 6. Truth after the view from nowhere. Nietzsche's critique of truth is often summarized with a careless slogan, "Everything is relative." That slogan misses both the severity and the ambition of his position. He does not say that every belief is equally useful or equally well supported. He attacks the fantasy of knowledge, purified of every perspective, purpose, effect, and form of life. Human knowing occurs from somewhere. It selects, organizes, compares, and interprets. The absence of a view from nowhere does not erase differences between careful inquiry and wishful thinking. Language is one source of interpretation. Words group unlike cases under common terms. We call many changing things leaves, promises, illnesses, or virtues. This compression makes communication and thought possible, but it can tempt us to mistake a useful category for a permanent structure in reality. Grammar encourages us to imagine a doer behind every deed and a stable substance beneath every change. Nietzsche asks whether some metaphysical convictions are habits of language hardened into pictures of the world. His early essay on Truth and Lies explores the metaphorical character of concepts, but later works do not merely repeat a youthful theory. In Beyond Good and Evil, he suspects philosophers of presenting their temperaments and moral commitments as impersonal discoveries. A system may be an involuntary autobiography. That observation does not refute the system. It changes how we examine it. Alongside its arguments, we investigate which distinctions it prizes, which experiences it ignores, and what form of life its truth would authorize. Perspectivism gives this inquiry a positive direction. In the Genealogy, Nietzsche reimagines objectivity as the ability to bring more eyes, different affects, and competing interpretations to bear. A single perspective sees something real but partial. A second can reveal the first one's blind spots. The result is not perfect neutrality. It is a more disciplined plurality. Good inquiry gains power by comparing perspectives, testing them against evidence, and learning to move among them without pretending to leave embodiment behind. Consider a conflict at work. One participant experiences a decision as necessary efficiency. Another sees the same decision as exclusion. A third studies its long-term effects. It would be lazy to conclude that all three accounts are equally true. Records may show that some recollections are false. Consequences may contradict confident predictions. Yet the event cannot be understood fully through one interest alone. Better judgment integrates evidence with awareness of how position directs attention. Perspective also has a temporal dimension. A belief may become visible only after its consequences unfold or after another vocabulary is available. The historian can see structures hidden from participants, while participants know textures absent from the archive. Neither position guarantees superiority. Good inquiry arranges their friction. This is why genealogy requires both documentary care and psychological imagination, and why imagination must be corrected whenever evidence refuses its story in detail. Nietzsche's perspectivism therefore demands more, not less, intellectual conscience. If perspectives shape inquiry, the investigator must examine the shaping. The investigator asks which desire makes an explanation satisfying, which evidence would unsettle it, and which alternative vocabulary changes what becomes visible. A dogmatist can ignore these matters because he mistakes his angle for reality itself. A simple relativist can ignore them because she treats comparison as pointless. Nietzsche's best account denies both forms of comfort. Still, the critique can turn against itself. If every philosophy is an expression of drives, why trust Nietzsche's philosophy? He sometimes embraces the reflexive difficulty and calls his own account an interpretation. That reply prevents him from claiming an exempt position, but it does not automatically justify the interpretation. It must still earn confidence through explanatory range, precision, and openness to correction. His genealogies can be judged historically weak, even if their method remains valuable. Truth itself also has a value that Nietzsche refuses to take for granted. He asks why truth should be preferred when an illusion supports life. He sometimes praises art because it grants appearance a good conscience. Elsewhere, he treats honesty as indispensable to overcoming nihilism. The tension is productive. Affirmation based on fantasy would affirm only the fantasy. Yet a life stripped of every simplifying interpretation may be impossible. The question becomes which fictions conceal reality, which models help us encounter it, and how much truth a form of life can transform without breaking. This question opens directly onto the death of God. Perspectivism is often summarized as the claim that everyone has a personal truth. Nietzsche's challenge is more rigorous. Every act of knowing selects, organizes, and interprets from conditions it cannot completely leave behind. There is no view from nowhere, but perspectives can still differ in range, discipline, honesty, and contact with evidence. The absence of an absolute standpoint does not make all standpoints equal. A narrow perspective may preserve itself by excluding every inconvenient fact. A stronger one can incorporate objections, compare scales, and acknowledge the interests that guide its attention. Nietzsche sometimes imagines objectivity as the ability to command several perspectives rather than erase perspective altogether. This objectivity is achieved through plurality and self-criticism. The claim has practical relevance wherever neutrality is performed. Institutions, scholars, journalists, judges, and scientists develop methods intended to correct individual bias. These methods do not create disembodied knowers. They distribute scrutiny, preserve records, demand reasons, and expose claims to possible correction. Perspectivism can support such disciplines because it explains why unaided sincerity is insufficient. It can also be misused to avoid evidence. Someone confronted with a false claim may retreat to the statement that this is merely another interpretation. Nietzsche's own practice does not support that laziness. He compares genealogies, reads texts, studies languages, and attacks interpretations he considers shallow. Interpretation is contestable because it must organize something that resists it. Facts do not speak without concepts, but neither can concepts make every description equally adequate. His language about truth as illusion reflects several targets: metaphysical certainty, forgotten conventions, moralized belief, and the human tendency to treat useful simplifications as the structure of reality itself. A map is selective without being worthless. Trouble begins when the map forgets its scale and declares everything omitted unreal. Nietzsche's suspicion asks which simplifications have become invisible through habit. Self-knowledge is subject to the same problem. A person interprets the past from present needs. One life can be narrated as endurance, failure, education, sacrifice, or accident. No narrative contains every event, yet some explain more honestly than others. A stronger narrative includes evidence that complicates the desired identity. It leaves room for other witnesses. Perspectivism, therefore, produces an ethic of intellectual courage. The goal is not endless hesitation, but a willingness to risk the perspective that supports one's power. Can the conviction survive translation into another vocabulary? Can it answer the strongest objection? Can it admit the conditions from which it sees? Truth after the view from nowhere remains possible as disciplined, revisable achievement rather than possession guaranteed by a pure subject. Part 7. The Death of God and the Long Shadow. The famous scene occurs in The Gay Science. A madman enters a marketplace carrying a lantern in the bright morning and announces that he is looking for God. The people there do not believe in God, so they laugh. He tells them that God is dead and that we have killed him. The audience's unbelief is precisely why their incomprehension matters. They think the work is finished because belief has faded. The madman understands that the consequences have barely begun. The death of God is not one event with one cause. It gathers changes in science, historical criticism, philosophy, religious conflict, and the demand for intellectual honesty. Christian Europe cultivated a respect for truth, then found that the same respect corroded traditional doctrines. Nietzsche sees an internal development. A value formed within Christianity turns against Christianity's claims. The result is not a clean victory of reason over superstition. It is a culture whose inherited moral vocabulary has lost the world picture that made its authority seem unconditional. The madman's images convey disorientation. Removing a horizon does not tell travelers where to go. Erasing a sun does not supply a new center. Nietzsche's concern is that Europeans will continue to rely on the shadows of the old God. They may replace providence with historical progress, divine law with supposedly self-evident morality, or salvation with political utopia. The names change while the structure remains. A final guarantee stands above life and judges it from outside. Nihilism arises when the highest values lose their value. This can mean several related conditions. A person may conclude that nothing has meaning because no cosmic purpose exists. A culture may continue honoring ideals it no longer believes, producing fatigue and bad faith. Values may condemn the world so severely that non-existence seems preferable. Or criticism may dissolve every commitment without developing the capacity to affirm anything. Nietzsche's notes explore these forms more explicitly than his published books, so any neat taxonomy should be offered with caution. The word nihilism can therefore describe a transition as much as a destination. Doubt may first appear as loss, then become an interval in which inherited rankings are suspended. Such intervals can feel empty because attention has been trained to recognize only the old sources of significance. Learning to perceive nearer goods, craft, friendship, inquiry, bodily presence takes time. Nietzsche's impatience with consolation should not obscure this slow education of attention. He often distinguishes passive from active responses. Passive nihilism seeks comfort, distraction, lowered expectations, or obedient return to exhausted beliefs. The last human in Zarathustra embodies a life arranged around safety and small pleasures, proud that serious longing has ended. Active nihilism breaks old tables of value and can clear space for creation. Yet destruction is transitional. If it becomes an identity, the rebel remains dependent on what he opposes. Negation alone cannot answer the need for orientation. There is also a temptation to cure nihilism through obedience to a strong leader, nation, or movement. This supplies direction by surrendering evaluation. Nietzsche's own disdain for mass politics should have made that cure impossible, although later readers selectively used his language to support it. The deeper answer to nihilism cannot be borrowed certainty. It must increase the capacity to evaluate, to bear disagreement, and to revise commitments without experiencing revision as total collapse. The crisis also concerns secular morality. Many readers reasonably believe that compassion, equality, and human rights can receive non-religious justification. Nietzsche does not prove they cannot. His genealogical and psychological challenge asks whether modern people understand the sources, costs, and tensions of the values they preserve. A secular principle may deserve loyalty, but not because it escaped history. It must be argued for under conditions where no transcendent authority ends the discussion. This is one place where Nietzsche's question outlasts his preferred answers. Modern pluralist societies contain religious and non-religious citizens, multiple moral traditions, and genuine disagreements about human flourishing. Shared norms cannot depend on everyone accepting one metaphysical foundation. Yet they cannot survive as arbitrary taste either. We need public reasons, institutional safeguards, and habits of mutual recognition. Nietzsche supplies no adequate democratic theory of these things. He does supply a powerful warning against pretending that their foundations are effortless. The madman finally says that he has come too early. Great events require time before they are seen. Cultural inheritance has momentum. People can inhabit moral forms whose theological support they reject, just as light from a vanished star continues to travel. Nietzsche writes during that interval, his task is to ask what kind of creators might live after the delayed light fades. To explore them, he abandons the familiar voice of the essayist and invents a prophet who must repeatedly learn the meaning of his own teaching. The madman's announcement concerns an event that many listeners do not yet understand. They may already be unbelievers, but practical and moral life still relies on inherited structures formed under Christian metaphysics. Removing belief from one sentence does not immediately transform conscience, equality, truth, guilt, history, or hope. The dead God casts a long shadow because values outlive the explanations that once held them together. Nietzsche's question is genealogical rather than merely celebratory. What happens when people continue to demand unconditional truth while denying the divine order that made truth sacred? What grounds equal dignity when the theological image of equal souls loses authority? Can compassion survive without becoming resentment or exhaustion? He does not assume that disbelief has answered these questions. Nihilism emerges when highest values devalue themselves. A standard promised to judge the whole of life, but the standard becomes unbelievable. The result can be disorientation, passive comfort, frantic distraction, political worship, or the demand for new absolutes. People do not necessarily become free spirits. They may seek harsher certainties because uncertainty is difficult to bear. The last man embodies one possible response. Risk is minimized, difference softened, aspiration exchanged for comfort, and the absence of greatness treated as peace. Nietzsche's contempt can become elitist, and ordinary security should not be dismissed by someone insulated from deprivation. Yet the image still asks whether safety has become the only publicly intelligible good. A life protected from every challenge may lose the conditions under which commitment develops. Another response is fanaticism. Nationalism, racial myth, revolutionary destiny, and charismatic politics can occupy the sacred vacancy. Nietzsche did not predict these movements in a simple sense, and his own hierarchical rhetoric created openings later appropriators exploited. Still, he understood that the loss of one absolute does not end the hunger for absolutes. The free spirit lives experimentally in the interval. Old values are examined without assuming that novelty is automatically superior. The experimental attitude accepts that a value must be judged through the kind of life it cultivates. This is slower than revelation. It requires memory, comparison, and willingness to revise. The death of God also has an emotional history. Belief may disappear intellectually while grief, fear, longing, or moral habit remain. Nietzsche's rhetoric of strength can obscure the genuine mourning involved when a world of meaning collapses. People do not rebuild orientation through argument alone. Communities, practices, art, and relationships carry values before they are fully formulated. The long shadow is therefore not simply a delay before liberation. It is the medium in which post-religious life continues to take shape. Nietzsche's challenge is to notice where inherited values still govern us, where they remain defensible, and where their hidden foundation has made them brittle. The task is neither to preserve every shadow nor to declare daylight achieved too soon. Part 8. Zarathustra and the Human Bridge. Thus Spoke Zarathustra was written in 4 parts between 1883 and 1885. It is philosophy in the form of parable, sermon, song, parody, and narrative. Its central speaker borrows the name of the ancient Iranian religious figure Zarathustra, or Zoroaster. Nietzsche chooses him because the historical Zarathustra was traditionally associated with a cosmic opposition between good and evil. The fictional Zarathustra returns to unsettle that opposition and announce a revaluation. The book resists extraction into a manual. Zarathustra teaches, fails, withdraws, returns, misjudges his listeners, and changes. His speeches echo biblical forms while reversing them. Animals sometimes understand what people do not. Disciples are told to leave their teacher. A doctrine may arrive through a dream or a riddle rather than an argument. This dramatic structure matters. Nietzsche explores the temptations of prophecy while using a prophet. The reader must ask where the character speaks wisely and where his loneliness distorts him. Zarathustra's demand that followers lose him is especially important. A teacher who produces copies has failed to create free spirits. Yet the theatrical force of the character continually attracts devotion. Nietzsche stages the contradiction instead of solving it. Education needs examples, but examples can become idols. The appropriate learner takes orientation from a figure, then turns away soon enough to discover a task that the figure could not prescribe in advance. The most famous figure is the Übermensch, best rendered as overhuman or overman, though no English term captures every resonance. It is not a biological race, a eugenic category, or a comic book superhuman. The German prefix suggests going over or beyond. Human beings are described as a bridge, not a completed end. The image concerns transformation through new valuation. It appears mainly in Zarathustra and is less central across Nietzsche's published corpus than popular summaries often imply. The overhuman can be read as an exemplary possibility, a name for someone capable of creating and embodying values after the death of God. But the figure remains deliberately underdescribed. Nietzsche does not provide a checklist. Zarathustra instead opposes it to the last human, who seeks comfort, equality understood as sameness, minimal risk, and relief from all demanding aspiration. The contrast expresses Nietzsche's fear that overcoming old authority might produce not freedom, but satisfied smallness. This fear identifies a real problem and encourages a bad simplification. A life devoted only to comfort can lose depth. Yet security, health, and protection from arbitrary suffering are not contemptible achievements. People may need stable conditions to create, care, learn, and take worthwhile risks. Nietzsche too often writes as though concern for vulnerability must flatten excellence. His opposition between higher possibility and herd contentment can obscure forms of greatness made possible by cooperation and equal standing. The overhuman is tied to remaining faithful to the earth. Values are not to be borrowed from a world beyond life. They must arise within embodied mortal existence. This does not mean that whatever feels natural is good. Nature contains disease, domination, tenderness, dependence, and waste. Faithfulness to the earth means refusing to devalue this life on behalf of a superior realm. The task is creative interpretation under finite conditions, not obedience to raw impulse. Zarathustra's teaching of the three transformations gives a compact picture. The spirit becomes a camel that bears inherited burdens, then a lion that says no to the great dragon of established commandments, then a child capable of a new beginning. The sequence is symbolic, not a program of developmental stages. Endurance matters because one must acquire strength. Refusal matters because inherited authority must be challenged. The child matters because creation requires play, forgetfulness, and an affirmative beginning that rebellion alone cannot supply. The unresolved problem is who authorizes the new beginning. If a creator simply announces values, the distinction between creation and domination becomes thin. Zarathustra's failures suggest that Nietzsche knew the problem. Teaching can become performance, solitude can become pride, and a dream of higher humanity can turn living persons into raw material. The book's ambiguity keeps the ideal open, but openness also limits its guidance. A sterner test is needed, one that asks whether a creator can affirm not only a chosen future, but the whole necessity of a life already lived. Part 9. The Weight of Recurrence. In the gay science, eternal recurrence enters as a thought experiment. A demon tells a solitary person that this exact life, in every detail, must be lived again innumerable times. Every joy, error, ordinary afternoon, and grief returns in the same sequence. Would the hearer curse the message, or regard it as a divine confirmation? Nietzsche calls the thought a great weight because it places pressure on one's relation to life as a whole. The doctrine has several interpretations. It may be a cosmological claim that a finite arrangement of forces in infinite time must repeat. Nietzsche explored versions of that possibility in his notebooks, though whether he established or even completed such an argument is doubtful. It may be an ethical test asking whether we can endorse our choices. It may be an existential exercise that transforms the present by removing the fantasy of a corrected life elsewhere. It may serve several of these functions without settling into one. The most accessible reading treats recurrence as a test of affirmation, but even this needs care. It cannot mean that a person should approve every injustice or avoid changing what can be changed. A decision to resist cruelty would also recur. Nor does the thought show that every event was good. It asks about the stance from which one can will a life whose parts are interdependent. To erase every wound might also erase relationships, insights, or commitments that grew through responding to it. Nor should recurrence become fatalism. The demon's message includes every decision and effort, not a spectator watching a completed script. If the thought changes how someone acts, that changed action belongs to the life being weighed. The test intensifies agency inside necessity. We cannot stand outside the whole and request different starting conditions, but we can become one of the conditions through which the next moment takes form within time. There is a harsh risk in this idea. Telling someone to affirm unavoidable suffering can become a way of silencing protest. The thought experiment should never replace practical efforts to prevent harm. Nietzsche's own language sometimes insufficiently respects that boundary. Recurrence is most defensible as a private test of one's orientation, not a judgment imposed on another person's pain. It examines resentment toward existence without denying justified anger at particular conditions. Amor fati, the love of fate, names the related aspiration. Love here exceeds resignation. Resignation says that an event cannot be changed. Amor fati seeks a relation in which necessity can be taken up as material for a life. In the gay science, Nietzsche wishes to become a yes-sayer and to see what is necessary as beautiful. The wish is future-facing and experimental. He does not claim to have achieved permanent serenity. An artisan provides a quiet analogy. A knot in a piece of wood interrupts the intended grain. The artisan can discard the board, hide the knot, or alter the design so that the irregularity becomes part of its form. Human suffering is morally more serious than difficult timber, and no analogy should erase that. Still, the image captures a limited point. Affirmation can mean composing with conditions one did not choose, without calling those conditions benevolent. Eternal recurrence also checks fantasies of heroic escape. The aspiring creator may dream of a future purified of the ordinary, weak, embarrassing, and accidental. Recurrence returns every neglected detail. The higher life cannot be purchased by mentally deleting the life that made it possible. A value worthy of affirmation must inhabit time rather than condemn the past as a mere staircase to glory. Nothing is omitted from the imagined return. The standard may be impossible. Perhaps no psychologically healthy person could welcome the recurrence of every horror. If so, the experiment still reveals gradients of affirmation. Which parts of life do we regard only as obstacles? Which commitments would survive repetition? What would need to change now for the thought of return to become less accusatory? Nietzsche's test offers no universal answer. It deepens the problem of value creation by connecting it to responsibility for the shape of a life. The next question is how such a shape is made. Eternal recurrence can be approached first as a test rather than a cosmological doctrine. Imagine that every detail of this life, including boredom, error, grief, and small kindness, must return without alteration. The thought removes the comfort of a corrected second edition. It asks how one stands toward the actuality that has occurred. The test is severe because no real life could be affirmed in a simple mood. Trauma, injustice, illness, and loss make universal celebration morally suspect. Telling another person to love fate can become a cruel refusal of suffering. Recurrence has force only as a question one confronts personally, not a command imposed on someone whose conditions one does not share. The demon's message also reveals what a person hopes will be erased. Much ordinary action depends on an imaginary future that will redeem present choices. One tolerates years of resentment because success will supposedly justify them. One postpones relationship until the important work is complete. Recurrence asks whether the form of life is worth repeating, not merely whether its promised endpoint is attractive. This does not require enjoying every event. Affirmation may mean refusing to let regret demand an impossible past. A person can oppose the recurrence of harm in practical terms while accepting that the fact of its occurrence cannot be changed. Amor fati is then not passive approval, but release from the fantasy that life begins only after history has been rewritten. Nietzsche also explored recurrence in cosmological notes, and scholars disagree about how literally to take the doctrine. The published philosophical impact does not depend on scientific proof that configurations repeat. As an existential experiment, the thought concentrates attention on relation to time. The test can guide small decisions without becoming a perfectionist burden. Would one want this habit, tone of speech, or pattern of avoidance to become a recurring structure? The question does not demand that every afternoon be magnificent. Repetition is part of any life. The issue is whether repetition serves a chosen form or quietly replaces choice. There is compassion hidden inside the severity. Everyone inherits circumstances and makes decisions without complete knowledge. To affirm a life includes affirming the conditions through which one's present capacity emerged, even when those conditions contain pain. This does not justify what others did. It recognizes that the current self cannot be separated cleanly from the history it condemns. Recurrence finally opposes the habit of treating existence as a rehearsal. The present is not valuable only because it leads elsewhere. A conversation, walk, task, or silence has a density that no future achievement can retroactively supply. The thought experiment asks whether one can become more answerable to that density. Part 10. Self-overcoming and the creation of values. Value creation is among Nietzsche's most attractive and most misunderstood ideas. It does not mean inventing preferences at random. A person cannot sincerely declare that betrayal is noble in the morning and make it so by force of will. Values emerge through patterns of attention, feeling, practice, judgment, and embodiment. To create a value is to make a way of evaluating credible in a life, perhaps eventually in a culture. The creation must survive consequences and conflict. Nietzsche's creators begin as interpreters. They inherit languages and habits they did not choose. They learn how existing values organize experience, then test whether those values support honesty, strength, plurality, art, and affirmation. Creation is therefore also revaluation. It changes the rank and meaning of available goods. Solitude may cease to mean social failure and become a condition for thought. Discipline may cease to mean obedience to an external authority and become fidelity to a chosen craft. Self-overcoming describes the movement by which a form of life transforms the standards that organized it. The self is not simply preserved while acquiring new possessions. It risks its current identity. A scholar devoted to winning recognition might gradually become devoted to the quality of inquiry, then discover that the new devotion requires surrendering cherished arguments. The energy of ambition remains, but its object and measure change. The earlier self supplies both the power and the resistance. A value proves itself through repetition. Courage is not created by admiring courage once, but by forming practices that make truthful action possible under pressure. Care is not established by a declaration, but by attention that continues when gratitude is absent. This practical dimension limits arbitrary invention. The creator also becomes answerable to the value. What began as an interpretation acquires authority through the discipline it demands and the world of relations it makes possible. This differs from motivational self-help. Nietzsche does not promise that anyone can become anything through confidence. He emphasizes inheritance, type, fortune, education, health, and the unequal distribution of capacities. His own perfectionist and hierarchical assumptions are often severe. Yet the more useful strand of self-overcoming concerns responsiveness to one's actual materials. It asks for neither unlimited choice nor passive acceptance. It asks what disciplined transformation is possible here. Several Nietzschean values guide the process without forming a complete moral code. Honesty prevents creation from becoming comforting illusion. Courage permits experiments without guarantees. Art gives form to complexity. Intellectual plurality allows several perspectives to correct one another. Generosity can appear as abundance rather than self-erasure. Solitude protects independence, while friendship provides resistance from another strong center. Above all, affirmation tests whether a value intensifies engagement with life or relies on condemning life from outside. The free spirit is therefore not necessarily a solitary owner of private values. Nietzsche's best friendships, real and imagined, involve distance as well as intimacy. A worthy friend does not merely confirm. The friend brings a separate measure, makes disagreement fruitful, and interrupts self-enchantment. Value creation can begin alone, but values meant to orient a shared life need the resistance of other creators. Otherwise, style hardens into decree or personal mythology. These standards immediately raise a meta-ethical problem. If values are created, are they merely subjective? Nietzsche often denies that values exist in nature as independent moral facts waiting to be discovered. Yet he evaluates constantly. He calls some interpretations sick, reactive, narrowing, or dishonest, and others rich, affirmative, or life-enhancing. Scholars disagree about whether this amounts to anti-realism, perfectionism, sentimentalism, or a privileged perspective addressed only to certain readers. A defensible reconstruction treats Nietzsche's evaluations as answerable to facts about the lives they shape, without pretending that those facts dictate one final morality. We can ask whether a value depends on false beliefs, whether it produces chronic self-hatred, whether it can coexist with other agents, and whether it expands or destroys capacities. These questions provide constraints. They do not eliminate conflict between goods. Courage can threaten safety. Independence can weaken care. Truthfulness can injure tenderness. Evaluation remains comparative and tragic. This is where domination must be distinguished from creation. A ruler can force compliance, but forced behavior alone does not establish value. Durable values require recognition, education, imitation, practice, and some capacity to answer the needs of those who live by them. Nietzsche is not consistent about respecting this distinction. At times, he imagines culture from the viewpoint of exceptional creators and treats others instrumentally. His own criterion of self-overcoming, however, points toward power that can transform itself, not merely subdue an object. That leads to the disputed concept most often mistaken for a license to rule. Self-overcoming is often reduced to relentless improvement, as though Nietzsche were an early motivational coach urging higher productivity. His idea is stranger. The self that overcomes and the self that is overcome are not two fixed entities. A pattern of valuation produces a person capable of questioning that pattern. Development can require turning against the very discipline that made development possible. An artist learns rules of composition before discovering which rules have become obstacles. A scholar acquires reverence for a tradition before becoming able to criticize it from within. A person survives through emotional armor and later finds that the armor prevents intimacy. In each case, overcoming does not mean despising the earlier form. The earlier form created capacities through which its limit could be seen. This distinguishes overcoming from novelty for its own sake. A new value is not strong merely because it violates convention. Rebellion can remain psychologically governed by the authority it attacks. If every choice is made to scandalize a parent, church, class, or audience, the opponent continues to set the terms. Creation begins when action gains a positive organization, not exhausted by reaction. Nietzsche's language of giving style to character suggests selection, arrangement, and patient work. Some tendencies are cultivated, others constrained, and apparent defects may be incorporated into a larger form. Style is not a cosmetic image presented to spectators. It is the relation through which multiplicity acquires direction. The danger is that aesthetic language can excuse harm if a beautiful life is treated as exempt from moral claims. Another person's suffering cannot become mere contrast in one's composition. Value creation is also never completely solitary. Language, practices, examples, and materials are inherited. Even the most original creator addresses possible readers, students, friends, or future communities. Nietzsche emphasizes exceptional individuals, but values survive only when embodied in shared forms. A private preference becomes culturally significant through teaching, imitation, contest, and revision. The demand to create values can feel grander than ordinary life allows. Most people do not found new moral epochs, yet smaller acts of re-evaluation are real. A man may decide that asking for help is compatible with strength. A family may replace inherited silence with truthful conversation. A workplace may value care that its metrics ignored. These changes do not emerge from nowhere, but they alter what becomes admirable and possible within a field. Self-overcoming, therefore, includes the ability to stop overcoming. Compulsive transformation can become another inability to affirm. A person who treats every stable commitment as stagnation may never inhabit a value long enough to test it. Nietzsche's challenge is not permanent restlessness. It is the strength to revise when growth requires revision, and the strength to remain when flight merely disguises fear. Creation finally carries responsibility for consequences the creator cannot fully control. New values may liberate some drives and wound others. They require criticism from perspectives the creator does not possess. An overcoming worthy of the name becomes more capable of receiving such criticism, not less. Otherwise, the language of transformation has only given pride a modern costume. Part 11. Will to power with necessary caution. The phrase will to power appears across Nietzsche's later writings, but it does not name one uncontested doctrine. In some passages, it describes a psychological tendency to overcome resistance and expand capacity. In others, it characterizes organic life. Elsewhere, it suggests a broader world of interacting forces. Many of the most sweeping formulations remain in notebooks. Any account that presents a finished metaphysical system called the will to power goes beyond what Nietzsche completed for publication. Even the word power can mislead. It may mean command over others, but it can also mean mastery of a skill, organization of impulses, capacity to endure tension, interpretive reach, or the ability to give. A musician gains power by submitting to years of technique. A thinker gains it by letting objections alter an argument. A generous person may experience power as an abundance that does not need to diminish another. Nietzsche's concept is relational. Power shows itself through resistance, incorporation, arrangement, and transformation. This helps explain his objection to treating self-preservation as the single basic drive. Living things do preserve themselves, but they also spend energy, risk stability, explore, compete, and transform environments. Nietzsche interprets life as reaching beyond bare continuation. Modern biology does not confirm a universal will to power, and it would be an error to recruit evolution as easy proof. The idea functions most plausibly as philosophical psychology and as an interpretive hypothesis about dynamic organization. Beyond good and evil gives the hypothesis a deliberately conditional form in a crucial passage. Nietzsche asks whether organic functions might be understood through a basic form of willing. The passage tempts a grand conclusion, yet its speculative grammar matters. Elsewhere, he treats the language of force as interpretation rather than final text. Scholars therefore disagree. Some see will to power as a cosmology. Others restrict it to psychology or treat it as one recurring model among several. The concept becomes dangerous when power is equated with successful coercion. Domination can show capacity, but it can also reveal dependence on weak opponents. A tyrant who requires universal submission may possess less inner organization than a creator who welcomes formidable resistance. Ressentiment itself is a form of power seeking. Nietzsche does not praise every expression simply because it wins. He asks about quality. Does power create or merely react? Can it incorporate difference? Does it need to degrade its object? Power can also be measured by what an agent can permit. A fragile identity needs constant agreement and treats every difference as injury. A more organized identity may tolerate ambiguity, criticism, and the independence of others without dissolving. This is not a complete Nietzschean doctrine, but it extends his admiration for abundance. Capacity appears in restraint as well as discharge, in leaving space as well as occupying it peacefully through disciplined form. Still, textual caution cannot sanitize the writing. Nietzsche sometimes describes exploitation and hierarchy as features of life, praises severe ordering, and treats the flourishing of higher types as more important than equal welfare. Those statements cannot be translated entirely into harmless self-development. The language exposes a gap in his positive project. If excellence is the primary measure, what protects people who do not fit his image of excellence from being used as means? A response available to us, though not fully developed by Nietzsche, is that power needs reciprocal limits. Human capacities grow through institutions of trust, education, criticism, and protection from arbitrary force. Equal political standing can support differences of achievement without declaring every achievement equal. From this perspective, domination often wastes power by silencing the perspectives and capacities of others. Nietzsche's pluralism of interpretation can support this correction, even when his hierarchy resists it. Will to power is therefore best retained as a question, not a master key. What resistance does a practice overcome? What capacity does it enlarge? What dependency does it conceal? Does a moral claim empower action or recruit guilt? Does a leader cultivate strong collaborators or demand smaller followers? These questions are diagnostically sharp. To answer them, Nietzsche develops a method that follows moral concepts backward through struggle and transformation. He calls that method genealogy. Part 12. Genealogy and the Value of Values. On the Genealogy of Morality appeared in 1887 as 3 connected treatises. It is more sustained than many of Nietzsche's aphoristic books, though it remains polemical and conjectural. Its guiding innovation is to distinguish the origin of a value from the value of that value. We may know how a moral practice arose without knowing whether it now supports flourishing. Conversely, a practice with a violent origin may acquire new uses that cannot be reduced to its beginning. Genealogy opposes the search for a pure essence. Moral concepts accumulate meanings through conflicts among groups, institutions, and psychological needs. Punishment, for example, may be used for compensation, deterrence, spectacle, memory, revenge, or exclusion at different times. Its current purpose does not reveal one original purpose. Nietzsche calls attention to the history of interpretations imposed on practices. This makes genealogy a study of descent, appropriation, and changing social function across long stretches of history. The method has several layers. Philology examines words and their transformations. History looks for actual institutions rather than imaginary contracts. Psychology asks what affects animate and evaluation. Physiology asks how a way of valuing expresses conditions of vitality or exhaustion. Finally, evaluation asks what the morality does to the people who inhabit it. Nietzsche moves rapidly among these layers, sometimes without providing the evidence a modern historian would reasonably require. A responsible genealogy therefore separates discovery from verdict, learning that a custom-served control can expose a concealed function, but present users may have transformed it. Learning that an ideal grew through suffering can explain its grip without making the suffering good. The genealogist must trace discontinuities, competing uses, and changes of scale. Otherwise, suspicion becomes a mythology of dark origins, as simplistic as the sacred history it recently replaced. That weakness matters. His etymologies can be speculative. His broad pictures of nobles, priests, creditors, debtors, and early communities are not a substitute for detailed social history. Genealogy works best as a critical hypothesis generator. It unsettles the assumption that present meanings were always present, then asks researchers to trace actual paths. Later genealogists, including Michel Foucault, developed the approach in different directions with more emphasis on institutions and practices. The genealogy also turns inquiry toward the evaluator. Nietzsche asks for a critique of moral values, but critique cannot float above valuation. What leads him to prefer life affirmation, strength, honesty, and creative excellence? His own standards have a history and a temperament. A consistent genealogy must expose them too. He occasionally acknowledges this reflexivity, though he does not provide a full genealogy of every value he uses in his own work. The method is strongest when claims receive different levels of confidence. A dated publication or letter can be established. A reconstruction of motive is interpretive. A broad story about prehistoric society may remain disputed. Nietzsche's rhetoric often blurs these levels to gain force. Contemporary readers can preserve the experiment while labeling its evidence more carefully. Genealogy then becomes an invitation to research, not permission to replace one's certainty with a dramatic suspicion. The book's three treatises form a descent into interior life. The first contrasts noble valuation with the morality of ressentiment. The second traces guilt and bad conscience through debt, punishment, social constraint, and internalized aggression. The third examines the ascetic ideal, which gives suffering a meaning while turning life against itself. Together they explain how a morality can answer real needs and still exact a severe human cost over time. This double vision is crucial. Nietzsche's targets are not foolish inventions that survived only because no one noticed their defects. Slave morality creates values. Bad conscience produces depth and memory. The ascetic ideal protects sufferers from meaningless pain. A genealogy that explained only error could not account for such endurance. Nietzsche's unsettling claim is that some of humanity's most admired achievements grow through damaging processes. What must be overcome cannot simply be removed without losing powers formed inside it. The first treatise provides the best-known example. It asks how the terms good, bad, and evil came to organize moral experience. Its answer is not a neutral history. It is a dramatic account of competing valuations, designed to change how the reader feels about familiar praise. We now enter that contest while keeping in view what the text illuminates, what it exaggerates, and what it leaves morally unprotected and exposed. Genealogy changes the object of moral inquiry. Instead of asking only which values are true, it asks how a value acquired authority, which practices made it feel natural, what affects it organizes, and what kind of person it produces. A moral term carries a history, even when speakers experience it as immediate conscience. This method resists origin myths. Institutions often explain themselves through noble purposes that emerged later. A punishment described as moral correction may have developed through debt, spectacle, revenge, deterrence, and administrative convenience. The current justification does not necessarily reveal the historical process. Functions can change while the practice remains. Nietzsche's own genealogies are provocative constructions, not neutral histories accepted in every detail. His broad contrasts between noble and slave morality, his linguistic evidence, and his account of punishment invite substantial criticism. Genealogy should therefore be applied to Nietzsche as well. What rhetorical interests shape his story? Which social positions disappear? Where does admiration for rank guide the evidence? The method remains powerful when used comparatively. Consider the value of productivity. It can express craftsmanship, contribution, economic survival, social status, fear of idleness, or an institution's need to measure labor. Genealogy separates these strands. It asks when productivity became a moral description of the person rather than a practical description of output. The analysis can reveal why rest produces guilt even after the practical task is complete. Genealogy does not automatically invalidate a value by revealing mixed origins. Justice may have emerged through conflict and still be worth defending. Compassion may carry power relations and still relieve suffering. The genetic fallacy remains a danger. Origins matter because they illuminate functions and hidden costs, not because old motives permanently determine present validity. The value of values must be judged through life, but life is not one simple metric. Whose life becomes stronger? Which capacities grow? What forms of dependence are created? Nietzsche's language sometimes privileges exceptional individuals at the expense of ordinary vulnerability. A contemporary genealogy should examine distributions of power that his aristocratic perspective minimized. Applied personally, genealogy asks where a severe inner rule came from. Whose voice did it once serve? What fear does it manage? Which behavior does it reward? The aim is not to blame parents or culture for every difficulty. It is to make the rule visible as a historical formation rather than an eternal command. Once visible, a value can be reaffirmed, revised, or refused more consciously. Genealogy does not leave us outside all values. The practice itself values honesty, complexity, historical memory, and the courage to examine what protects identity. Its deepest lesson is that inheritance becomes responsibility when its history can be faced. Part 13. Noble values, slave values, and ressentiment. Nietzsche distinguishes two patterns of valuation. Noble or master valuation begins with an affirmative sense of self. The noble type calls its own strength, courage, truthfulness, generosity, beauty, or social standing good. Only afterward does it name the contrasting ordinary type bad. Bad in this scheme means low, common, or unimpressive, not metaphysically evil. The evaluative movement begins with self-description. It says yes to itself before it says no. Slave valuation begins under conditions of subordination. Those unable to discharge hostility directly retain and transform it. They first identify the powerful opponent as evil, then define themselves as good by contrast, patient rather than aggressive, humble rather than proud, harmless rather than dangerous. The word slave describes a position in Nietzsche's model, but he ranges across social, religious, and psychological meanings without always separating them. The result is suggestive rather than a dependable history of a single uprising. Ressentiment is the effective engine of this reversal. The French word, retained in many translations, suggests a grievance repeatedly felt again. It is more organized than momentary resentment. When action is blocked, memory rehearses injury, imagination supplies revenge, and moral judgment gives this reaction a noble interpretation. The powerless gain a form of power by changing the meaning of power. The enemy's strength becomes evil. One's inability to retaliate becomes goodness. This analysis is disturbing partly because it identifies a possibility within genuine moral insight. A person who condemns cruelty may do so because cruelty is wrong, because she resents the cruel person's freedom, or through a mixture of both. Nietzsche presses on the mixture. Moral language can defend the vulnerable while also providing a stage for disguised revenge. The presence of ressentiment does not refute the judgment, but it may affect how the judgment is expressed and what remedy it seeks. The distinction is frequently misused as a personality quiz. Confident people are called masters, anxious people slaves, and ordinary decency is dismissed as weakness. Nietzsche's text is subtler and more hazardous. Master and slave moralities are patterns that combine in cultures and individuals. Noble action can be brutal and oblivious. Reactive morality can display extraordinary creativity. Nietzsche even grants the slave revolt a transformative achievement. It deepens the human animal, creates new meanings, and makes history psychologically interesting. Ressentiment should also be distinguished from sustained protest. A grievance can be remembered because the harm continues or because repair has been refused. Forgetting under those conditions may serve the injurer. The diagnostic question is not whether anger lasts. It is whether anger can describe the good it protects, respond to evidence, accept proportionate repair, and imagine a future not wholly governed by the offender. Those capacities separate moral memory from captivity to revenge. The names also do moral work before the argument begins. Master sounds admirable, slave sounds contemptible. But actual slavery is domination enforced through violence and deprivation. The oppressed person's condemnation of the oppressor need not be secret envy. It can be accurate recognition of injustice. Nietzsche's model often underestimates this. He is alert to revenge disguised as justice, yet less alert to privilege disguised as nobility. A genealogy applied symmetrically must investigate both. Suppose a respected institution excludes a group for generations. When excluded, people demand equal standing, and Nietzschean suspicion might ask whether the demand hides resentment toward excellence. A fuller inquiry asks additional questions. Was the institution's excellence partly enabled by exclusion? Did its standards confuse inherited access with merit? Does equality remove the conditions for achievement, or enlarge the field in which different achievements can appear? Nietzsche's categories sharpen the first suspicion but cannot decide the case. Christian morality is the main target of the first treatise. Nietzsche argues that it universalizes values born from the standpoint of sufferers and directs hostility toward pride, sensuality, strength, and worldly flourishing. His historical narrative fuses Judaism and Christianity in ways that are polemical and often offensive. He opposed the political anti-Semitism of his time, but opposition to an anti-Semitic movement does not purify every passage. His rhetoric sometimes draws on anti-Jewish Christian stereotypes even while attacking Christian culture. The conceptual insight can be separated from that rhetoric without pretending the rhetoric is incidental. Values may be reactive when their identity depends entirely on an enemy. A movement organized only by opposition risks preserving the hated object at the center of its imagination. This applies to religious moralism, revolutionary purity, nationalism, and personal grievance. The remedy is not to stop condemning wrong. It is to develop affirmative goods that can guide life when the opponent is absent. Nietzsche prefers a generosity associated with abundance. The noble type may honor worthy enemies, forget injuries, and give without needing gratitude. Yet his portraits can romanticize confidence and neglect the social conditions that make magnanimity easier for the secure. What looks like healthy forgetfulness from above may look like refusal of accountability from below. Memory can poison, but it can also preserve truth for people whose injuries were publicly denied. The residue of the master and slave analysis is therefore diagnostic, not a ranking of human groups. It asks whether a value begins by affirming a good or by requiring an enemy. It asks whether justice seeks repair or the pleasure of humiliation. It asks whether strength can recognize dependence and whether vulnerability can speak without idealizing powerlessness. These questions become more intimate in the second treatise. Ressentiment directs force outward in imagination. Bad conscience turns force inward and makes the self both artist and material. Part 14. Debt, Memory, and Bad Conscience. The second treatise begins with a surprising image of human development, the breeding of an animal able to promise. A promise binds a future self. To make one credibly, a person needs memory, predictability, and some command over changing impulse. Nietzsche calls this a memory of the will. It is not mere recollection. It is the organized capacity to carry an intention across time and to answer for it later. Nietzsche pairs this cultivated memory with an active capacity to forget. Forgetfulness is not always deficiency. It can keep consciousness from being crowded by every unfinished impression. Without selective release, action becomes difficult because the past presses equally from all sides. Healthy responsibility, therefore, requires both powers. Enough memory to keep faith, and enough forgetting to prevent obligation from occupying the whole field of present life, attention, and future action. Such capacity is valuable, But Nietzsche imagines its formation through severe social discipline. Communities make conduct calculable by fixing customs and consequences. Pain serves as a mnemonic in his conjectural history because what hurts is difficult to forget. The account is deliberately grim and should not be mistaken for a documented universal sequence. Its philosophical point is that responsibility has a history written into bodies. The apparently autonomous individual is formed by practices that precede autonomy. Nietzsche links the German word for guilt with the word for debt. The creditor-debtor relation provides his model for early responsibility. An injury creates an obligation. Punishment offers compensation or satisfaction. Over time, economic and legal meanings acquire moral and religious depth. Debt to ancestors expands, and under monotheism can become debt to an absolute creditor. The possibility of repayment diminishes as the creditor's magnitude grows. Guilt becomes inexhaustible. Modern etymology and anthropology do not confirm every step of this story. The relation between debt, punishment, and guilt is more varied than Nietzsche's dramatic reconstruction suggests. Yet the model exposes a feature of moral experience. We often imagine wrongdoing through accounts that must be balanced. Someone owes an apology, restitution, service, or punishment. The metaphor can clarify responsibility. It becomes destructive when the person is treated as identical with an unpayable account. Bad conscience emerges when outwardly directed instincts are blocked by settled social life and turn against their possessor. The animal adapted to roaming, conflict, and immediate discharge is confined within custom. Aggression becomes self-surveillance. The person learns to split into judge and accused. Nietzsche describes this as an illness, but also as the source of inward depth. The same power that once formed an external world begins shaping memory, intention, imagination, and an ideal self. This ambivalence prevents a simple call to return to instinct. There is no innocent animal state available. Conscience makes promises, art, restraint, and complex cooperation possible. Its cruelty can also become self-hatred. The task is to transform inwardness so that discipline serves creation instead of endless punishment. Nietzsche's image is developmental. A dangerous capacity has not yet reached a finished form capable of mature affirmation through future experiments and correction. An ordinary failure shows the difference. After breaking a promise, someone may acknowledge harm, apologize, make restitution, and change a habit. Guilt directs attention toward repair and then recedes. Bad conscience in the harsher sense makes the failure evidence that the whole person is corrupt. Because no finite action can repay an infinite accusation, self-punishment becomes repetitive. The pain feels morally serious while avoiding the practical risk of re-entering relationship. Nietzsche is strongest when he reveals how punishment can fail to produce responsibility. Inflicted suffering may create caution, secrecy, or hard memory without creating insight. A person can learn that power is dangerous while learning nothing about why an action harmed someone. This remains relevant wherever institutions confuse severity with moral education. Accountability needs truthful memory and consequence. But not every consequence cultivates reflective agency in practical life among people and within institutions. His own alternative, the sovereign individual, creates another puzzle. This figure can promise and answer for the future with proud independence. Some scholars treat it as Nietzsche's ideal. Others read the portrait ironically or as one moment within the history he will complicate. If agency is shaped by drives and social formation, sovereignty cannot be absolute. The attractive core is dependable self-command, not exemption from human dependence and mutual formation. Bad conscience also reveals a limit in the language of health and sickness. Moral conflict is not always pathology. Remorse may be an appropriate response to wrongdoing. A conscience troubled by injustice can motivate repair. Nietzsche sometimes diagnoses too quickly, using vitality as though it settles ethical validity. A healthy exploiter remains an exploiter. Psychological integration matters, but it cannot replace consideration of what an agent does to other people. What survives is a model of moral interiority as made rather than given. Conscience is a social achievement with creative and punitive possibilities. We can ask whether a practice forms people capable of promising, repairing, and directing themselves, or people trapped in permanent accusation. The third treatise explains why permanent accusation has been so compelling. It gives pain a cause, a meaning, and a ritual of response. Nietzsche calls its organizing framework the ascetic ideal. Part 15. The ascetic ideal and the need for meaning. Ascetic practices limit appetite, pleasure, possessions, sexuality, noise, or social involvement. Nietzsche does not treat every such practice as life-denying. A philosopher may need simplicity, solitude, regular habits, and freedom from distraction. An artist may accept severe constraints to protect attention. In these cases, restraint serves a fuller activity. The ascetic ideal begins when restraint becomes a supreme interpretation that judges embodied life itself as guilty, fallen, or inferior. The third treatise asks what this ideal means for artists, philosophers, priests, sufferers, and scholars. Its power lies in flexibility. The same outward discipline can express different needs. A philosopher's quiet room and a penitent's self-denial may look similar while carrying opposite evaluations of existence. Genealogy refuses to infer meaning from behavior alone. It asks which project organizes the behavior and what guiding affect gives it sustained force across changing circumstances and disciplines. For the sufferer, the ascetic priest provides an interpretation. Pain is no longer meaningless. It becomes punishment for sin, evidence of impurity, or an opportunity for redemption. The interpretation may protect a person from the blank question of why suffering exists. Nietzsche's crucial insight is that people often need meaning more urgently than relief. An injurious explanation can prevail because unexplained pain is harder to bear alone over time without a shared social language. Meaning need not arrive as a complete doctrine. Shared work, truthful witness, care for another person, or participation in a practice can locate pain within a larger pattern without declaring pain deserved. Nietzsche offers fewer examples of such ordinary meaning than his critique requires. They matter because they show an alternative to both cosmic explanation and emptiness. Finite purposes can be real to finite creatures even when the universe supplies no final commentary. The cost is a redirection of ressentiment. The sufferer wants a cause, preferably a blameworthy cause. The priest points inward. You are the cause of your suffering. The result can restore agency in a distorted form. If guilt produced the pain, penitence may control it. But the medicine deepens the illness by joining distress to self-condemnation. The person gains a reason and loses innocence before moral judgment in the eyes of authority. Nietzsche recognizes the priest as a skilled physician of a sick herd, not merely a fraud. The priest organizes community, moderates destructive outbreaks, supplies rituals, and makes endurance possible. This concession strengthens the critique. An ideal can be functional and damaging at once. Removing it without understanding the need it met may leave people exposed to meaninglessness. A successor must offer forms of interpretation that do not require contempt for the body. Science might appear to be the obvious opponent. Yet Nietzsche argues that modern science can inherit the ascetic ideal's unconditional will to truth. It rejects theological content while preserving the demand that truth possess supreme value regardless of consequence. This does not make scientific methods equivalent to religion. It raises a philosophical question about their motivation. Science can establish many facts. It cannot, through fact alone, establish why truth should always outrank every other good. The critique remains valuable if stated carefully. Reliable inquiry has public procedures for testing claims, and Nietzsche's perspectivism should not be used to weaken them. The value of truth can be defended through its roles in prediction, cooperation, freedom from manipulation, and responsiveness to reality. But these are value arguments, not additional measurements. Science operates within a human world where research priorities, risks, and uses require continuing ethical judgment and public deliberation. Art provides a different opposition because it acknowledges appearance. Rather than pretending to escape perspective, art arranges perspective visibly. It can give suffering form without calling suffering divine punishment. This returns us to tragedy. A work of art does not erase loss. It creates a shareable structure in which loss can be perceived, remembered, and perhaps integrated. Nietzsche sometimes overstates art's innocence. Art, too, can serve propaganda, vanity, and escape. Its advantage is a capacity to make interpretation perceptible as interpretation. The ascetic ideal culminates, in Nietzsche's account, in a will to nothingness. Human beings would rather will nothing than not will at all. The formulation distinguishes nihilism from simple absence of desire. Nihilism can be intensely purposeful. A person may organize life around condemning life. A movement may find unity through purification, sacrifice, and enemies. The danger is not emptiness alone, but a powerful direction aimed against the conditions of living. Nietzsche's attack on Christianity is most uncompromising in the Antichrist. He contrasts Christian pity and otherworldliness with values of strength and earthly life. The book contains acute psychological criticism, sweeping historical claims, and harsh generalizations. It often fails to distinguish Christian traditions, practices, and interpretations. Christianity has supported ascetic denial, but also art, community, intellectual inquiry, care, resistance to domination, and affirmations of embodied creation. A fair evaluation cannot compress this diversity into one diagnosis. The broader lesson is quieter. When an inherited ideal declines, we should ask which burden it carried. If it explained suffering, formed community, restrained revenge, and sustained hope, a replacement must address those tasks or openly revise them. Value creation begins from this inventory. It cannot consist of mocking people for needing meaning. The next challenge is social and political. Who gets to create? Whose costs count? And how Nietzsche's language of rank behaves when it leaves the interior life and enters a shared world. Part 16. Rank, Politics, Women, and the Problem of Domination. Nietzsche is often presented as an uncomplicated individualist. The label is misleading. He values singularity, solitude, and independence from mass opinion. But he is deeply concerned with culture, education, inheritance, and the social conditions that cultivate human types. His higher individuals do not emerge outside history. They depend on languages, teachers, institutions, labor, and audiences. Nietzsche sometimes recognizes this dependence, then writes as though the exceptional person alone justifies the arrangement. His preferred horizon becomes increasingly European rather than narrowly German. He mocks national vanity and imagines future good Europeans formed through cultural mixture and intellectual mobility. This cosmopolitan gesture remains elitist, and it does not amount to modern international democracy. Still, it separates his project from racial nationalism. Culture, for him, is a field of translation, contest, and long formation, not the pure expression of a sealed biological people or nation. He offers no systematic political philosophy comparable to a theory of rights, law, or the state. Scholars disagree about whether his writing supports aristocratic radicalism, agonistic democracy, meritocratic culture, or an anti-political perfectionism. The disagreement is possible because the texts pull in different directions. Nietzsche attacks nationalism, the German state, anti-Semitic movements, socialism, liberalism, democracy, and egalitarian morality. He praises rank, contest, European cultural mixing, independence, and higher achievement. These do not assemble into one program. His anti-democratic remarks are not decorative. He worries that equality will become sameness and that majority comfort will govern every standard. He sometimes treats suffering and hierarchy as necessary conditions for excellence. Beyond Good and Evil contains language about exploitation that cannot be safely reduced to metaphor. Readers are right to ask whether his culture of greatness would protect those designated ordinary, weak, dependent, or useful to others without consent. Nietzsche's challenge to democratic complacency can nevertheless be separated from rejection of equal standing. Democracy may flatten differences when popularity becomes the only measure of worth. It may also create a protected field in which uncommon experiments can occur without permission from inherited rank. Equal rights need not mean equal talents, identical lives, or universal admiration. They can mean that no person's vulnerability ever licenses another person's ownership or command. Agon, the Greek idea of contest, offers one bridge. A productive contest needs rivals capable of answering back, rules preventing annihilation, and a shared world in which distinction can appear. Without limits, contest becomes conquest and loses the resistance through which excellence develops. Nietzsche appreciates worthy enemies, but does not fully translate that respect into institutions. A democratic reader can. Equal civic protection may preserve the plurality that demanding competition requires. His remarks about women present a sharper obstacle. Across the works, Nietzsche makes sweeping claims about femininity, mocks women's emancipation, and uses sexual hierarchy as an image for truth and power. Some passages are voiced by characters or shaped by parody, and the styles complicate interpretation. Complication is not exoneration. The recurring generalizations reflect prejudices and failed understanding. They cannot be repaired by turning every offensive line into convenient irony. At the same time, women readers and feminist philosophers have used Nietzschean tools to expose how gender identities are produced, disciplined, and naturalized. This is a legitimate appropriation, but it is often critical and selective. A method can exceed its author's judgments. Genealogy helps ask whose interests a gender norm serves, which effects it trains, and how it came to look inevitable. Perspectivism helps expose the supposed universal viewpoint as socially located. These uses work against parts of Nietzsche as much as through him. His relation to anti-Semitism requires equal precision. Nietzsche repeatedly expressed hostility toward the anti-Semitic political movement and became disgusted by his sister Elizabeth's association with it through her husband, Bernhard Förster. He also rejected aggressive German nationalism and increasingly styled himself a good European. These facts strongly oppose the picture of Nietzsche as a Nazi precursor. They do not license a sanitized portrait. Scholars debate anti-Jewish tropes and judgments in his writings, especially where Judaism is fitted into his genealogy of slave morality. The difference between Nietzsche and later fascism is decisive. Fascist mass politics, racial nationalism, state worship, and biological anti-Semitism conflict with central strands of his work. Yet fascist readers did not invent every appealing word from nothing. His contempt for equality, admiration of hardness, language of breeding, and romanticized hierarchy supplied material that could be detached and repurposed. Intellectual responsibility requires holding both statements together. The appropriation was a distortion, and the texts contained dangerous openings. The central human question now returns in political form. How can values be created without domination? Nietzsche supplies three partial safeguards: suspicion toward herd certainty, respect for plural perspectives, and self-overcoming that directs force back toward the creator's own form. But he supplies too little about rights, consent, material dependence, and the claims of people outside his preferred types. Other ethical and political traditions must add these protections from their own resources. This addition is not an external decoration. If perspectives are embodied, then coercion can destroy knowledge by preventing some perspectives from speaking. If value creation needs experimentation, then basic security gives more people the capacity to experiment. If self-overcoming requires resistance, then institutions must protect critics from elimination. Nietzsche's own concepts can therefore explain why limits on domination are productive conditions, even though he did not consistently draw that conclusion. A pluralist answer can retain aspiration while refusing human sacrifice. Values are tested not only by the intensity they create in exceptional lives, but by whether people affected can contest them, whether harms are acknowledged, and whether institutions permit revision. No single measure ends disagreement. The point is to prevent the creator's perspective from becoming the only perspective withstanding. This is not a view from nowhere. It is an arrangement among finite viewpoints. Nietzsche might object that such safeguards express the morality he attacks. The objection should be heard, then answered. Some limits do arise from fear of difference. Others protect the conditions in which difference survives. A society without equal protection may produce monuments and masters while silencing unknown capacities. Greatness measured only from above does not know what it has prevented. Nietzsche teaches us to ask about hidden costs. We should apply that teaching to his hierarchy. The result is not a domesticated Nietzsche who endorses modern democracy. It is a productive confrontation. His standards of honesty and transformation criticize complacent institutions. Democratic equality criticizes his instrumental treatment of persons. Each exposes a danger in the other. Grey conformity on one side, romantic domination on the other. Value creation after inherited foundations requires this kind of reciprocal resistance. It also requires historical vigilance, because ideas continue to live through editors, movements, and readers their authors never controlled. Part 17. The Archive, the Appropriations, and the Objections. Nietzsche's productive life ended after his collapse in Turin in early 1889. He never recovered the capacity for sustained philosophical work. He lived until 1900, cared for first by his mother and later by his sister. The cause of his final illness remains a subject of medical and historical debate, and retrospective certainty is unwarranted. For the history of the philosophy, the essential fact is that Nietzsche could no longer control the publication and framing of his writings. The final productive year had been extraordinarily intense. Twilight of the Idols offered a compressed survey of his mature attacks. The Antichrist extended his campaign against Christian valuation. Exe Homo interpreted his earlier books and fashioned an intellectual self-portrait whose extravagant chapter titles demand attention to tone. These works are philosophically serious, but their self-dramatization makes them poor sources for a simple biography. They show Nietzsche actively arranging how a future audience might read him. Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche became the manager of his literary estate. She had been involved with Bernhard Förster, an anti-Semitic agitator who attempted to establish a German colony in Paraguay. Her political commitments and editorial ambitions shaped Nietzsche's public image. She built an archive, promoted her brother as a cultural prophet, and cultivated powerful visitors. Her work preserved materials while also arranging them within a politically misleading legend for future readers. The most consequential editorial object was the will to power. Nietzsche had considered plans for a major work under that title, then abandoned or transformed those plans. The published volume assembled selected notebook fragments and presented them as though they formed a completed book. Later critical scholarship, especially the work associated with Giorgio Colli and Mazzino Montanari, restored chronological and textual context. The notebooks remain important evidence, but they must be read as notes, drafts, trials, and abandoned formulations. This distinction changes interpretation. A striking notebook sentence may contradict another note or disappear from the published work. Nietzsche's books underwent selection, arrangement, revision, and stylistic shaping. Treating every fragment as equally authoritative erases his authorship. It also encourages systematic readings in which will to power becomes a final explanation of everything. The digital critical edition now provided by Nietzsche Source makes works, letters, and posthumous fragments available with stable scholarly references, reinforcing the separation between published texts and Nachlass. National Socialist appropriation later joined selective quotation, editorial history, ideological desire, and the power of the archive's image. Nietzsche was made compatible with forces he had opposed, including racial anti-Semitism, German nationalism, and worship of the state. His sister's role was important, but blaming her alone is too simple. Later interpreters and institutions actively constructed their Nietzsche, while troubling features in his language eased their ideological work of distortion. After the Second World War, influential readers worked to separate Nietzsche from fascism and re-establish him as a philosopher. Existentialists, psychologists, literary theorists, genealogists, and post-structuralists found different resources in him. Martin Heidegger treated Nietzsche as a major figure in the history of metaphysics. Michel Foucault transformed genealogy into an analysis of practices, power, and historical contingency. Artists and writers drew on masks, self-creation, and style. These receptions are interpretations, not proof that Nietzsche secretly held every later position. The variety of reception is itself evidence about the form of the work. Aphorisms travel easily, and dramatic figures invite identification. A sentence detached from its neighboring cautions can become a slogan for liberation, cruelty, therapy, or politics. Reading Nietzsche responsibly, therefore, requires restoring sequence, genre, and date. The question is not only what a sentence can be made to say, but what task it performed in the book where Nietzsche placed it. Claims about Freud and Jung need restraint. Nietzsche explored unconscious motivation, repression, dreams, drives, and self-deception before psychoanalysis became an institution. There are affinities and episodes of reception, but influence is not a single direct line, and each later thinker built distinct concepts. Calling Nietzsche the inventor of modern psychology mistakes suggestive anticipation for disciplinary foundation. Resemblance alone does not establish historical inheritance or influence. The distinction matters for intellectual history. The strongest philosophical objections can now be gathered. First, genealogy risks the genetic fallacy. Explaining an origin does not determine present validity. Second, the historical evidence is often too conjectural for the confidence of the rhetoric. Third, Nietzsche criticizes values from evaluative commitments whose authority he cannot fully justify. Fourth, perspectivism risks self-undermining unless his own perspective can be assessed by standards beyond force. Fifth, the celebration of hierarchy leaves inadequate protection against domination. Additional objections arise from experience he marginalizes. Compassion can express strength and accurate attention, not decadence. Equality can protect plurality, not abolish rank in every domain. Guilt can support repair without becoming self-hatred. Religious faith can affirm embodied life rather than flee it. Disability and dependence can contain forms of agency that a narrow language of health fails to see. His misogyny and anti-democratic judgments are not isolated blemishes. They expose limits in whose flourishing he readily imagined. What survives these objections is substantial. Nietzsche teaches us to ask what a value does, not only what it claims. He shows that moral psychology includes effect, embodiment, and history. He makes intellectual honesty examine its own desire for truth. He identifies resentment that hides inside righteousness and self-punishment that hides inside virtue. He treats a philosophy as a practice of formation, capable of changing the reader who evaluates it. His method should also be used against him. We can ask which 19th century hierarchies shaped his sight, what bodily experience entered his metaphors of health, what desire for exceptional readers intensified his contempt, and how his solitude informed his image of creation. This is not dismissal. It is Nietzschean reading without discipleship. The final value of the work lies less in a table we can inherit than in a more demanding way of testing every table, including his. Nietzsche's posthumous archive became a struggle over authorship. Notes, drafts, abandoned formulations, and published works do not carry equal authority. Yet later, editors could arrange fragments into the appearance of a finished system. The collection known as The Will to Power is the clearest warning. It is not a book completed by Nietzsche, though individual passages are genuinely his. Citation without editorial history can make a notebook experiment sound like a final doctrine. Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche played a major role in managing the archive and cultivating a public image compatible with her nationalist and anti-Semitic commitments. Nietzsche himself expressed contempt for anti-Semitism and German nationalism in important passages and letters. This evidence matters. It does not make every aspect of his thought immune to authoritarian appropriation. His praise of hierarchy, contempt for equality, language of breeding, and attacks on democratic morality supplied material that could be detached and intensified. The association with Nazism is therefore neither a simple identity nor a pure fabrication. Nazi readers selected, edited, and mythologized him, often against central parts of his work. They also found rhetoric that could be made useful. Responsible interpretation must do both pieces of work, document distortion and examine vulnerability. Nietzsche's remarks about women present a similar challenge. Some are spoken through dramatic masks, some are ironic, and some criticize conventional relations. Others reproduce misogyny without needing to be rescued by style. Declaring every offensive line, a joke turns ambiguity into immunity. Reading context can complicate a statement without erasing its content. His politics do not fit ordinary categories. He attacks the state, nationalism, mass movements, socialism, liberal equality, and parliamentary culture. He imagines ranks among human types and sometimes treats suffering as material for higher achievement. This makes him difficult to recruit consistently for either libertarian individualism or authoritarian collectivism. The difficulty is philosophically productive only if the harms inside his hierarchy remain visible. Objections from moral and political philosophy ask whether self-creation can protect those who lack power, whether pity is always diminishing, and whether flourishing requires the subordination of others. Nietzsche exposes resentment within moral language, but suspicion can become indiscriminate. A complaint about injustice is not refuted by discovering anger in the complainant. Anger may register a real violation. His genealogical method also risks explaining away truth through motive. If every argument is diagnosed as a symptom, the diagnostician's own claim needs the same treatment. Nietzsche often embraces this reflexivity, but his rhetorical confidence can outrun it. The reader must preserve standards of evidence that allow diagnosis itself to be criticized. The mature approach neither sanitizes Nietzsche nor abandons him to appropriators. It reads published texts carefully, distinguishes archival levels, compares translations, and permits admiration to coexist with refusal. A thinker of masks should not be granted one final innocent face. The plurality of his work is a reason for greater precision, not for interpretive permission without limits. Part 18. A lantern set down quietly. We began with a culture continuing beneath old stars after their authority had faded. Nietzsche's central question was how human beings might create and evaluate values in that interval without falling into nihilism or domination. His answer is dispersed across changing works, and it remains incomplete. Values must be examined historically. They must be felt in bodies and tested in forms of life. They should survive honesty, permit transformation, and answer the challenge of affirmation. No inherited command is exempt from inquiry, but no private preference becomes worthy merely because it is new. The most persuasive Nietzsche is the diagnostician of hidden inheritance. He notices that disbelief can preserve religious structures, that moral judgment can disguise revenge, and that suffering seeks meaning even at the cost of self-accusation. He sees the self as a cultivated plurality rather than a transparent ruler. He understands objectivity as an achievement made stronger by differences of perspective. He makes creation answer to resistance because power without resistance has no measure. The doubtful Nietzsche is the legislator of rank. His contempt often outruns his understanding. He does not adequately protect ordinary persons from being treated as material for somebody else's excellence. His generalizations about women, democracy, pity, and whole religious traditions reduce the plurality his own method teaches us to seek. The later misuse of his work was not faithful interpretation, yet it warns how quickly a language of hardness and breeding can escape the inward discipline of self-overcoming. We therefore need not choose between obedience and rejection. A mature encounter can preserve the question while revising the answer. Value creation can be understood as a shared and contested practice. Individuals and communities propose ways of living. Consequences answer? Other perspectives object? Memory preserves costs? Institutions make revision possible. Equal standing need not settle what excellence means. It keeps the argument from being ended by naked force or inherited status. In ordinary life, revaluation is usually quiet. A family discovers that loyalty no longer means silence. A profession learns that exhaustion is not proof of devotion. A person separates remorse that repairs from guilt that merely repeats. A community keeps a ritual after changing the story it once told about the ritual. In each case, inherited material is neither worshipped nor discarded. Its function is examined, its cost named, and its future form tested. Nietzsche offers no comfort of final foundations. He also refuses the conclusion that their absence makes care, truth, art, or courage unreal. Human valuation is vulnerable because it is human. It can be distorted by fear and power. It can also become more honest through criticism, more spacious through perspective, and more durable through practice. The lack of cosmic guarantee makes evaluation harder. It does not make careful evaluation unnecessary. Perhaps this is the deepest meaning of remaining faithful to the earth. It is to create without pretending to stand outside the conditions of creation. It is to remember that bodies tire, that perspectives differ, that power tempts, and that every table of values casts a shadow. Affirmation then becomes neither cheerful denial nor surrender to fate. It becomes the patient art of giving form to a finite life while allowing other lives to answer. The madman's lantern was lit in the morning because the people around him could not yet see the darkness their certainty concealed. We can imagine that lantern much later, no longer waved above a startled crowd. It rests on a table among several readers. Its circle of light is limited. Beyond it, much remains unresolved. Yet within that modest brightness, inherited words can be inspected, new meanings can be tried, and no single hand needs to own the flame.